This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. From time to time I was going to be doing a series on what I consider to be some of the most dramatic moments in church history. It will discuss certain events which I considered to be especially interesting in the history of the church. Not all of these events are necessarily good events, but certain things which were quite dramatic and might hold interest for some people. And the event I want to talk about now is the Fall of Constantinople in the year 1453. Constantinople is the eastern city which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire at the time. Now, it should be remembered that in the year 1054 there was the Great Schism of the East, where the eastern churches and the eastern part of the church largely went into schism by rejecting the papacy. However, there were reunions on occasion. For instance, at the Council of Florence, there was a reunion with some of the schismatics in the East who were reconciled to the Church. But the point is that in the centuries after 1054, the East was frequently and largely in schism from the true Church. And during this period, Islam continued to grow and strengthen and rise. And about the year 1300, the Ottoman Empire was created, which was an empire of the false religion of Islam. And this empire dominated areas in the Middle East and northern Africa and started to make inroads into the Christian East. And what's quite interesting is that the areas which eventually succumbed to the dark and false religion of Islam and its empire were the seas which were most notorious for schismatic separations from the Church of Rome. Eventually, Islam would come to occupy Alexandria and Jerusalem and Antioch and Constantinople, all of these seas which went into schism by rejecting the papacy. It's almost as if God allowed them, once they were separated from the vine, to be completely engulfed by the darkness of the Islamic Empire. But he didn't allow Islam to proceed into the Christian West, Italy, etc. And so, in 1453, Islam is strengthening its position in what was the Christian East, or claimed to be Christian East. And they had a new young leader named Muhammad II. And he was only about 19 years old. And he was very ambitious and zealous for his false religion and his empire, and decided that he wanted to try to attack Constantinople. And the Muslims had tried to do this many times in the past, but were always unsuccessful. And a big reason for this is that the city itself was extremely well fortified. It was surrounded by waterways on the north, the south, and the east, and the only approach to the city by land was from the west. Historian Warren H. Carroll, and I'm going to be quoting from him, in his book, The Glory of Christendom, A History of Christendom, Volume 3, page 564, explains why it was so difficult to attack and overtake the imperial city of Constantinople. Quote, "The land approach from the west was blocked by a gigantic double wall, largest in the medieval Christian world, faced by a moat and breastwork, the outer wall 25 feet high and 10 feet thick, the inner wall 40 feet high and 20 feet thick, with 60-foot octagonal watchtowers at frequent intervals. The original wall had been built almost exactly 1,000 years before and had been kept in excellent repair. None of the many sieges of the great city had ever breached it." End quote. And so, the one main way to enter by land had this huge, seemingly impregnable wall. But Muhammad II decided that he would try to use gunpowder to bust through the wall. But he needed more powerful artillery. And as Carroll explains, in the summer of 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Urban came to Constantinople and offered his services to the enemy of Christendom. Muhammad II had brought him into his personal presence. Urban told him he could cast a cannon that would blast the wall of Babylon itself. Muhammad paid him well and told him to proceed. 3 months later, Urban delivered his cannon. It was 27 feet long and 8 inches across the muzzle, and hurled a colossal ball weighing 1,200 pounds a full mile. 60 oxen and 700 men were required to move it. No stone wall man ever made or imagined could stand against this thundering titan. The age of walled cities had ended." End quote. And so we have a Hungarian offering his engineering abilities to the biggest enemy of Christendom. And he helps them construct this massive cannon that they would use to try to break the wall of Constantinople. And I think this demonstrates how treacherous people can be, how some of them will do almost anything for themselves. If he was well compensated, he's willing to facilitate the overthrow of what was the Christian Eastern capital. With this huge cannon, Constantinople looked to be in trouble, because that was its main defense at this time. A huge army was approaching it, and so on April 6th, Muhammad II, the infidel leader, made his formal demand for the surrender of Constantinople, and the demand was refused. So the bombardment began a few days later, and the huge cannon that Urban had created could only be fired 7 times a day because it took so long to load the gigantic ball. On April 21st, a tower fell, and the first breach opened in the outer wall, but it was repaired. And they even were considering abandoning the effort because they thought that naval assistance would come from the Christian West. But the Muslims decided that the Christians were so divided that they wouldn't come to the aid of Constantinople. On May 27th, a Sunday, Urban's cannon was brought up to hammer the weakened outer wall in the Lycus Valley at point-blank range and blasted a large breach in it. With this large breach, they prepared for their grand assault, and the people inside the city removed and tried to protect the icons, and also had processions, and were singing in the hope that God would deliver them from this invasion. And what's very interesting is Carroll points out, quote, "The Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, erected originally by Emperor Justinian 900 years before, the largest church in Christendom, because the modern St. Peter's Basilica had not yet been built, was filled with worshippers, the bitter disputes over the reunion of Florence forgotten." And so you had the largest, quote, Christian church in the world at that time, and it was filled with people who were hoping and praying that this assault would be averted. But the grand assault on Constantinople began at 1:30 in the morning on Tuesday, May 29th, 1453. There was a fierce battle as the Muslims rushed in, but there were just too many of the infidels. And when they took the closest tower and put the flag with the crescent and star, the symbol of Islam, at the top of it, it was very demoralizing for the defenders of Constantinople. And then one of the commanders was killed, and many began to flee at that point once they saw the flag of the Muslims on the tower. Carroll sums up the despair of the Byzantine emperor on page 567. He says, quote, "He saw with a clear and steady vision that the battle was lost, and the siege and the city and the empire, a whole world slipping into darkness and the deep. Few rulers have ever faced so cosmic a disaster. A Constantine, son of Helena, had built this city more than 1,000 years ago. Another Constantine, son of another Helena, had now lost it forever." End quote. As the invasion was occurring, inside the church at Hagia Sophia, Mass was finished, and the Blessed Sacrament was in the tabernacle, and people began to run into the church, but the Muslims stormed in, and they brought all of the people outside the church, and they started to distribute them like slaves. Carroll points out, quote, "They tore down the great crucifix and carried it through the streets with a janissary's cap on its thorn-pierced head, shouting, 'Behold the God of the Christians.' Sultan Muhammad II, entering the city, rode directly to Hagia Sophia and proclaimed it a mosque. The sack of Constantinople went on for 3 days. 4,000 Christians were killed, more than 50,000 others. Virtually the entire surviving population was seized, and all but the few who could pay large ransoms were enslaved. And the city itself was renamed by the Muslims Istanbul, and that's the name it carries today. Everything Christian in Hagia Sophia was torn away or covered with whitewash. Every decoration was stripped as a prize of war. but the altar was left standing. Every day for 900 years Mass had been said upon it, not once, never again. For 540 years, as of this writing, has the body and blood of God come down to the high altar of Hagia Sophia." End quote. I found that to be a particularly interesting and dramatic event in church history. Obviously, I think it represents the overtaking of the schismatic East by the darkness of Islam, how God allowed it as a punishment for their separation from the true church. But also it shows how God sometimes allows evil to prevail on earth, even though justice reigns eternally in the next life. I also found it interesting because it shows how unless there's a concerted effort to fight against evil, it will have victories, and that false Christians who give assistance to the enemies of God can be effective in changing the course of history.